From the very beginning, I knew I wasn't the son-in-law my in-laws had envisioned for their perfect, delicate daughter. Alicia, my wife, had always been their little princess, the center of their world. And to them, I was nothing more than an intrusion, a man who had taken her away from the pedestal they had placed her on since birth. They never said it outright, but their actions spoke louder than any words ever could. No matter how hard I worked, how much I provided, or how much love I poured into our marriage, I was never truly welcomed. At best, they tolerated me. At worst, they ignored me completely, as if my presence in their lives was a necessary burden they had to endure for Alicia's sake. If Alicia wanted something, she got it. If I wanted something, I was asking for too much. The balance was never in my favor. I told myself it didn't matter, that my marriage was about Alicia and me, not her parents. I convinced myself that, over time, they would see me for who I was, that they would recognize the way I loved her, that things would get better. They never did. The signs had been there since the very beginning. The disapproving glances during family dinners, the way her mother, Helen, would sigh whenever I spoke, the way her father, Lawrence, would pat my shoulder with an empty, condescending smile as if to say, "You'll never be enough." The way they looked past me when speaking to Alicia, as if I didn't exist at all. It wasn't just the small things, though. There were bigger moments where I should have realized that I was fighting a losing battle, like the time they planned a family vacation and conveniently forgot to invite me. Or when Alicia's mother redecorated our home without consulting me, assuming her opinion mattered more than mine. Or the time Lawrence dismissed my career, stating outright that I wasn't ambitious enough for their daughter. Alicia never defended me. I never knew if it was out of fear, indifference, or simply the fact that, deep down, she agreed with them. And maybe that was the worst part, not their treatment of me, but the fact that my own wife never stood by my side. Still, I endured because I loved her, because I believed in marriage, because I thought that if I held on long enough, they would finally see that I was worthy of their daughter. But love isn't always enough. And then one night, it all came crashing down. I had just returned from work. Exhausted, my mind already fixated on the small comforts of home. The idea of a warm shower, a quiet dinner, and maybe, just maybe, the possibility of a night without tension hanging in the air like an unspoken storm. But as soon as I stepped through the door, I knew something was wrong. The atmosphere was thick, suffocating. The lights were dim, but Alicia wasn't curled up on the couch with a book like she usually was. The house was silent, too silent, except for the faint sound of murmuring voices coming from the living room. My heartbeat quickened, and with every step toward that room, I felt the weight of something heavy settling over me. And then I saw them. Alicia, sitting on the couch, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her parents, standing nearby, their faces void of warmth. They weren't just visiting. They were waiting for me. Something about the way they were positioned, the way Alicia refused to look at me, made my stomach tighten. I shut the door behind me and placed my keys on the table, keeping my voice steady. "What's going on?" Helen exchanged a glance with Lawrence, and then Alicia finally spoke. "We need to talk." A simple phrase, yet so final, so distant. I exhaled, rubbing the back of my neck. "Okay, I'm listening." Her father took a step forward, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. "You're not a good match for Alicia. You never were." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I blinked, trying to process what I had just heard. "Excuse me." Lawrence's voice was steady, as if he had rehearsed this speech many times before. "We've tolerated this marriage for long enough. But it's clear that Alicia deserves better. You don't provide the kind of life she needs. You hold her back." My fingers curled into fists at my sides. Hold her back. Alicia finally met my gaze, and what I saw in her eyes sent an even deeper pain through me. "Emptiness. No one wants you here," she said flatly. I felt the air leave my lungs. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. Surely, she wouldn't say something like that. Surely, the woman I married wouldn't turn her back on me so coldly, so effortlessly. But then Lawrence and Helen nodded in agreement. And I knew I had never been part of their family. Not really. I swallowed hard, my jaw tightening as I looked at Alicia one last time. "Is this what you want?" I asked. She didn't answer. And that silence was all the confirmation I needed. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just turned on my heel, walked upstairs, and packed my bags. Every shirt, every pair of shoes, every last trace of me in that house. I shoved it all into a suitcase, moving on autopilot. My hands were shaking, my vision blurred, but I refused to break down in front of them. When I walked back downstairs, they were still standing there, still watching me like I was a stain they were finally wiping away. Alicia said nothing. Helen sighed in what sounded like relief. Lawrence turned his back on me before I even reached the door. I stepped outside, pulling the suitcase behind me, and for the first time since I had married Alicia, I felt something unexpected. Not sadness, not heartbreak, but relief. I walked to my car, tossing my bag in the back seat, and sat behind the wheel for a moment, staring at the house that had never truly felt like home. Then, without another glance, without another thought, I started the engine and drove away. And just like that, my marriage was over. It was a Friday night, the kind of night where all I wanted was a little peace. I had spent the entire day grinding at work, dealing with deadlines, office politics, and the usual chaos that came with earning a living. By the time I pulled into the driveway, exhaustion clung to me like a second skin. All I wanted was to step inside, take off my shoes, and breathe. Maybe even enjoy a quiet dinner, assuming Alicia hadn't already eaten without me, which lately had been the norm. But the moment I stepped through the door, I knew something was off. The air was too still. No television noise. No clattering from the kitchen. No casual, "Hey, you're home," from Alicia. Instead, she was sitting on the couch, her arms tightly crossed over her chest, her face unreadable. The way she was sitting, rigid, upright, told me whatever was happening wasn't good. Then I saw them. Her parents, Lawrence and Helen, standing near the window, their expressions mirroring hers, cold, distant. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. Something about the way they were positioned, the way Alicia refused to meet my eyes, made me uneasy. I closed the door behind me, dropping my keys onto the table with a quiet clink. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice steady but cautious. Lawrence sighed like I was wasting his time. He had always looked at me like I was some charity case Alicia had picked up off the street. It didn't matter that I had a stable job. It didn't matter that I had taken care of his daughter, provided for her, made sure she never lacked a thing. In his eyes, I would never be good enough. "We need to talk," Alicia finally said, her voice clipped, emotionless. I glanced between the three of them, my chest tightening. "Okay," I said slowly. "I'm listening." Helen exhaled, folding her hands in front of her like she was bracing for impact. Lawrence, on the other hand, didn't hesitate. "You're not a good match for Alicia," he said. "You never were." His words hit harder than I expected. I blinked, trying to process what I had just heard. My first instinct was to laugh, because surely this was some kind of sick joke. "Excuse me?" I asked, but Lawrence didn't waver. "We've tolerated this marriage for long enough," he continued, his tone as sharp as a blade. "But it's clear that Alicia deserves better." Deserves better. The phrase bounced around in my head. But before I could even react, Alicia finally looked at me. "No one wants you here," she said. Her voice wasn't loud or cruel, but it was final, like a verdict, like a sentence, like I had just been erased. I felt the air leave my lungs. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, to ask her how she could say something like that so casually. But then Helen nodded in agreement. Lawrence crossed his arms, standing beside his wife like this was some group intervention, like I was some kind of burden they had finally decided to cut loose. And I understood. I had never been part of their family. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. I swallowed hard, my jaw clenching as I looked at Alicia. "Is this what you want?" I asked, my voice quieter now. Her gaze flickered for a brief moment. Everything in her expression almost looked like guilt. But then she nodded. And that was it. That was the moment I realized I had spent years fighting for a place in a home where I was never welcome. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just walked upstairs. Every step felt heavier than the last. I passed by the wedding pictures on the hallway walls, the smiling images of a man who had once believed in love and loyalty, in the idea that marriage meant fighting together, not against each other. I had been a fool. I reached the bedroom and grabbed my suitcase. My hands were shaking, but I moved with purpose, with clarity, shoving clothes, shoes, and personal belongings into my bag with calculated precision. No hesitation. No second guessing. If they wanted me gone, then I would go. By the time I returned downstairs, they were still there. Alicia hadn't moved. Helen was already scrolling through her phone like she had more important things to do. Lawrence looked vaguely impatient, like he was waiting for me to finally take the hint and leave. No last words. No apologies. Just silence. I looked at Alicia one last time, hoping, maybe foolishly, that she would say something, anything. But she just turned her head away. And so I walked out of that house without looking back. The night air was cold as I tossed my bag into the back seat of my car. My fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, my knuckles turning white. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the house that had never truly felt like home. Then, without another glance, I started the engine and drove away. The entire ride was a blur. I don't remember the streets I passed. I don't remember the traffic lights or the way the city looked under the dim glow of street lamps. My mind was somewhere else, stuck in that living room. Darn that moment when my wife had told me I wasn't wanted. At some point, I found myself in front of a cheap motel. I checked in without thinking, paid for a single night, and carried my bag up to the room. The space was small, cramped, with flickering lights and a bed that looked like it had seen better days. But it was mine. I sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the floor, waiting for the heartbreak to come, waiting for the pain, waiting for the regret. But instead, I felt relief. A weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in years, I didn't have to worry about pleasing Alicia, about proving myself to her parents, about shrinking myself down just to be tolerated. I was done trying. That night, I had the best sleep I'd had in years. No tension, no walking on eggshells, no Alicia, no in-laws, just silence. And then, the next morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. 29 missed calls. I walked out of that house without looking back. No goodbyes. No last words. Just the cold realization that I had wasted years of my life trying to fit into a place where I was never truly welcome. I had driven for what felt like hours, though in reality, it had only been 30 minutes before I found myself pulling into a motel parking lot. The neon sign flickered erratically, casting a dull glow onto the cracked pavement. It wasn't glamorous, but it would do. I didn't need comfort, I just needed distance. I checked in without thinking, barely paying attention to the bored-looking receptionist who slid a key card across the counter. The room was small, with stiff furniture and a bed that creaked when I sat on it. But I didn't care. I dropped my suitcase onto the floor, exhaled, and let my body sink into the mattress. For the first time in years, I was alone. And for the first time in years, I felt free. There was no tension hanging over me like a storm cloud, no walking on eggshells around Lawrence and Helen, no pretending I didn't hear the passive-aggressive comments from Alicia when she thought I wasn't doing enough, wasn't trying enough, wasn't good enough. It was just me, and the silence. I waited for the sadness to come. I expected to feel some kind of deep, crushing sorrow. the kind that usually comes with the end of a marriage. But instead, I felt something else. Relief. I should have felt heartbroken. I should have been angry. But I wasn't. Instead, I lay back on the bed and let out a long breath. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't drowning. That night, I had the best sleep I'd had in years. No nightmares, no waking up to Alicia's cold indifference, just peace. But then morning came, and my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. I squinted at the screen, a little groggy from sleep. 29 missed calls. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe work needed me. Maybe it was an emergency from a friend. Then I saw the names. Alicia, Helen, Lawrence. My lips curled in amusement. Now they cared. I ignored the calls, tossed the phone onto the nightstand, and let it ring. Then the text messages started. Alicia, you're being dramatic. Come back home. Helen, enough of this nonsense. Stop acting like a child. Lawrence, this is bigger than you. You need to come back. I laughed bitterly. Bigger than me. Funny. When they sat me down in that living room and told me I wasn't wanted, that wasn't bigger than me. That was fine. That was acceptable. That was normal. But now that I was gone, suddenly there was a problem. I ignored them. Then, Alicia sent the text that caught my attention. Alicia, come home now. We have a problem. I raised an eyebrow. A problem. Curiosity got the best of me. I finally texted back just 2 words. What happened? Her reply came almost instantly. Alicia, my father screwed up. Bad. Now this was interesting. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Lawrence, the same man who practically kicked me out, was now in some kind of trouble. I could only imagine what it was. A financial issue, a business failure, an affair gone public. The possibilities were endless, and for the first time in a while, I found myself entertained by their misfortune. Still, I didn't reply. I let them sweat. I went about my morning like nothing had happened, took a long shower, had a mediocre cup of motel coffee, sat in the stiff chair by the window, and just watched the world outside, taking my time. My phone continued to buzz. Alicia, this isn't funny. Pick up your phone. Lawrence, we don't have time for this. Get back here now. Helen, we need your help. And then, finally, the bombshell. Alicia, my father's been arrested. I sat up, grinning. Now they needed me. Oh, how the tables had turned. I could only imagine Lawrence sitting in a holding cell, fuming, his pride in tatters. The same man who had spent years making me feel like an outsider, like I was some kind of stray dog his daughter had foolishly taken in, was now reaching out to me for help. I stretched out in my chair, feeling more at ease than I had in years. They had spent so long pushing me aside. Now, they were desperate. I could picture Alicia pacing in the living room, her mother probably crying at the kitchen table, both of them realizing that the one person they had discarded might be the only one who could fix this mess. But here's the thing. I didn't owe them anything. Not my sympathy. Not my time. Not my effort. They made their choice when they told me I wasn't wanted. And now, it was my turn to show them what that really meant. I grabbed my phone, smirking as I typed out a single deliberate response. Figure it out without me. Then I turned off my phone, leaned back, and enjoyed my first real morning of freedom. I sat in that motel room, staring at my phone, watching as the notifications kept rolling in. Calls, texts, desperate messages. It was almost funny how quickly things had changed. Yesterday I was an inconvenience, an outsider, the unwanted husband who had been barely tolerated, never truly accepted. Today they needed me. I ignored them for hours, letting them stew in their own mess. At first, I thought maybe they would give up. But then the texts became more frantic. Alicia, you're being petty. This isn't about you. Helen, enough is enough. You need to come home. Lawrence, if you have any decency left, you'll help us. Decency. Now that was ironic. Where was their decency when they sat me down like an unwanted guest and told me I wasn't good enough? Where was their decency when they let me pack my bags, walk out the door, and never once tried to stop me? I wasn't the one who abandoned them. They abandoned me. And now, because Lawrence had been arrested, they wanted me back. I took my time. I left my phone on silent, stepped out of the motel, and walked to a nearby cafe. The sun was warm against my face, the scent of fresh coffee drifting in the air. And for the first time in a long time, I felt weightless. No expectations, no responsibilities, no one breathing down my neck, telling me I wasn't enough. I sat at a small table by the window, sipping my coffee, watching the world move around me. It was strange how peaceful everything felt, despite the chaos waiting for me on the other side of my phone screen. A few hours passed. Then, Alicia sent the text that caught my attention. "Alicia, come home now. We have a problem." I stared at the words for a long moment, debating whether or not to respond. A problem. Now that was interesting. I wasn't stupid. I knew exactly what was happening. They weren't reaching out because they suddenly cared about me. They weren't texting because they had realized their mistake. They just needed something. Probably money. Probably help. And I had a choice. I could walk away, ignore them, let them handle their own mess, or I could let them suffer for a little while longer. I decided to text back. "What happened?" Alicia's response came almost instantly. "Alicia, my father screwed up. Bad." I took another sip of my coffee, leaning back in my chair. I knew Lawrence had skeletons in his closet. He always acted like he was some flawless, successful businessman. But I had seen the cracks in his perfect image long before now. The hushed phone calls, the tension in his voice, the way Helen always seemed nervous when money was brought up. I just never thought it would all come crashing down this fast. I let her sweat for a bit. No reply. The messages kept coming. "Alicia, he's been arrested. Alicia, we need your help. Helen, we don't have time for this. You're still family. Lawrence, be a man and step up." I almost laughed out loud. Be a man and step up. This was the same man who couldn't wait to get rid of me, and now he was telling me to step up. I let my fingers hover over the keyboard, debating what to say. Then, with a smirk, I typed, "Figure it out without me," and I turned off my phone. I finished my coffee slowly, taking my time, enjoying the quiet, because I knew this was only the beginning. I let them sweat. I turned my phone off and went about my day like their little family crisis didn't exist. And honestly, it felt good. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing to fix things, wasn't bending over backward to prove my worth to people who had never valued me in the first place. I walked through the streets with a newfound sense of freedom, breathing in the crisp air, stopping at a park just to sit on a bench and do nothing. No Alicia, no in-laws, just me, finally existing without the weight of their judgment crushing my shoulders. But I wasn't naive. I knew they wouldn't stop. People like Lawrence and Helen weren't used to being ignored. They weren't used to being desperate. So I turned my phone back on just to see how much they had spiraled. I wasn't disappointed. Dozens of missed calls. A flood of text messages. "Alicia, you're being ridiculous. Just come home." "Helen, I can't believe you're doing this to us." "Lawrence, enough of your tantrum. We need to talk." A tantrum. That was rich, coming from the people who sat me down like a problem to be discarded just days ago. I kept scrolling. And then I saw the message that made me grin. "Alicia, my father's been arrested." I chuckled under my breath, shaking my head. It wasn't even shocking. Lawrence had always walked around like a king, acting like rules didn't apply to him, like his wealth and influence would protect him no matter what. But here's the thing about men like him. They always fall. And when they do, it's never graceful. I leaned back on the bench, letting the afternoon sun warm my skin, debating what to do next. I could ignore them, Let them deal with it on their own. But where was the fun in that? Instead, I decided to let them suffer just a little bit longer. 5 more hours. That's how long I made them wait. By the time I finally responded, the desperation in Alicia's texts had reached new heights. Alicia, please, just answer me. Helen, this is serious. He's in jail. Alicia, we need money for bail. There it was. Money. It was never really about me. Never about wanting me back. They just needed a wallet. I smirked as I finally typed out a response. Not my problem. The reply came instantly. Alicia, are you serious? Alicia, this is my father we're talking about. Alicia, you're my husband. You can't just walk away. That last one almost made me laugh. Husband. Since when? I thought I was the unwanted one. I thought I wasn't good enough for their perfect little family. Now suddenly, I was supposed to play the role of the loyal spouse just because their world was crumbling. I let the phone ring a few more times before finally picking up. What do you want? I said, my voice calm. There was a sharp inhale on the other end. Finally, Alicia breathed out, frustration thick in her voice. We need to talk. I'm listening, I said, though I was far from interested. You need to come home, she said. I scoffed. No, I really don't. She exhaled sharply. Stop acting like a child. My father's been arrested, and we need to get him out. We, I repeated mockingly. Last I checked, I wasn't part of your family anymore. That's what you and your parents wanted, right? Silence. Then her voice softened. Please, this is serious. Now that was something I had never heard before. Alicia saying, please. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. And what exactly do you need from me? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. She hesitated, then finally said it. Money for bail. Bingo. Ah, I said, dragging out the word. So this is about money, not about me. Just about what I can give you. That's not fair, she snapped. This is family. I grinned. Funny how I wasn't family 2 days ago, when you told me no one wanted me around. More silence. She had no argument, because there wasn't one. You don't understand. She tried again. My father is in real trouble. Good, I said, my voice void of sympathy. Maybe he'll finally learn what it's like to be powerless. Her breath hitched. You don't mean that. I absolutely do. She let out a frustrated groan. I can't believe you're doing this. I smirked. Believe it. And then, just to twist the knife a little deeper, I added, figure it out without me, just like you always wanted. Then, before she could say another word, I hung up. I stared at my phone for a moment, watching as more texts flooded in. Alicia was panicking. Helen was begging. Lawrence was still silent, probably because he had no access to a phone from behind bars. I could have helped them. I could have sent the money, bailed Lawrence out, and gone back to being the puppet they had always expected me to be. But I wasn't that man anymore. They had made their bed, and now they could lie in it. I took my time. Alicia had called me 7 more times after I hung up, and each one went unanswered. Her mother, Helen, had sent an embarrassing number of text messages, each one more desperate than the last. Lawrence, the man who had never once respected me, the man who had looked down on me like I was some stray dog his daughter had foolishly married, had finally broken his silence. His message: Lawrence, we don't have time for your childish tantrum. Be a man and help your family. I stared at the text for a long moment, chuckling under my breath. Be a man. It was funny, really. This was the same man who had spent years belittling me, acting as if I would never measure up to the kind of man Alicia deserved, the same man who, just 2 days ago, had told me to my face that I wasn't good enough. Now, I was supposed to step in and rescue him, and he still had the nerve to act like he was doing me a favor by letting me help. I put my phone down and went about my day. took a long, leisurely shower, ordered some room service, sat by the motel window with a coffee in hand, watching the world go by as if my in-laws' entire reality wasn't crumbling. It wasn't until late afternoon that I finally decided to make my next move. I got in my car and drove, but I didn't go straight to their house. No, I made them wait, took a few detours, stopped at a gas station, grabbed a bottle of water, took my sweet time doing anything but rushing. By the time I finally pulled into the driveway, the energy had shifted. Gone were the smug, superior expressions. Gone was the overconfidence. Now, they were desperate. Lawrence was pacing outside, his hands clenched into fists, his face twisted in barely controlled frustration. Helen was sitting on the porch steps, her hand shaking as she gripped her phone like it was her lifeline. Alicia stood by the door, her arms crossed, her entire body tense. As soon as I stepped out of the car, all three of them turned to look at me. "Where the hell have you been?" Lawrence barked, his voice sharp, like he had any authority over me. I smirked. "Not here, like you wanted." His jaw ticked. Helen stood up quickly, her face lined with stress. "Listen, we don't have time for games. You know why we called you." I nodded, casually shutting my car door. "Oh, I know." Alicia took a step forward, her voice softer, almost pleading. "We need you." Now that was something I had never heard before. I folded my arms. "You need me." Alicia swallowed, hesitating. "Yes." I let the silence stretch between us, enjoying the way they all squirmed. "So let me get this straight," I said, my voice slow, deliberate. "You told me I was unwanted. You let your father insult me. You let your mother treat me like an outsider. But now that Lawrence is in trouble, you suddenly remember I exist." Alicia exhaled sharply. "It's different now." I raised an eyebrow. "Is it?" Lawrence stepped forward, his frustration boiling over. "This is about family." I laughed, loud, mocking. "Oh, now we're family." I shook my head, letting out a low whistle. "That's funny, because 2 nights ago, I was a burden, remember?" Lawrence's face darkened, but before he could say anything, Helen cut in. "We'll pay you back," she said quickly. "We just need the money for bail. It's just temporary." I looked at Alicia. "You agree with them?" She hesitated before nodding. "It's my father. Of course I do." I stared at her for a long moment, letting the reality of the situation sink in. I had spent years breaking my back for these people, trying, fighting, begging for a place at a table where I was never welcome. And now, after everything, they still didn't want me back. They just wanted my money. "No," I finally said. Alicia blinked. "What?" I said no. Lawrence clenched his fists. "Don't be a fool. You know how serious this is." "I do," I said with a nod. "And it's not my problem." Alicia's eyes widened, genuine panic flashing across her face. "You can't just walk away." I smiled. "Sure I can. We're your family." Helen tried again. I tilted my head. "Am I? Because that's not what you told me the other night." Silence. For the first time in his miserable life, Lawrence looked defeated. Alicia looked like she wanted to cry. Helen's face was pale, her lips parted in shock. They had expected me to roll over, to be the good, obedient husband they could use when it was convenient. But that wasn't who I was anymore. "You'll regret this," Lawrence finally said, his voice low. I shrugged. "No, Lawrence. You will." I turned on my heel and walked back to my car, feeling lighter than I had in years. I could hear Alicia calling after me. But I didn't stop, didn't look back. I got in, shut the door, and pulled out of the driveway. And for the first time since I had married Alicia, I felt something new. Power. The power to say no. The power to finally put myself first. The power to let them burn in their own mistakes. And it felt incredible. I didn't look back as I drove away from that house. Their house, not mine. I could still hear Alicia's voice calling after me. There was a time when that voice could stop me in my tracks, when I would have turned around immediately, desperate to fix whatever problem they had. Not anymore. This time, I kept driving. This time, I let them drown. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the road ahead. And for the first time in years, I actually felt like I was heading towards something better instead of just trying to survive in a life that never truly belonged to me. I didn't regret saying no. I didn't regret the look of pure horror on Helen's face, or the way Lawrence clenched his fists, realizing that his golden reputation couldn't save him this time. For once, they had no control. For once, I was the one holding the cards, and it felt incredible. Still, I knew Alicia wasn't done. They weren't the type to accept defeat so easily. I pulled into a small diner, ordered myself a meal I actually enjoyed for once, not some overpriced, pretentious dish Alicia insisted on, and sat by the window as I checked my phone. Just as expected, they had kept going. New messages flooded in, one after another. Alicia, you left. Are you serious? Helen, don't do this. We'll talk. Just help us first. Lawrence, you'll regret this. Mark my words. I smirked at that last one. Lawrence, still thinking he could intimidate me, even from jail. I ignored all of them and took my time eating. For the first time in ages, food actually tasted good, probably because I wasn't swallowing it down in the presence of people who constantly made me feel like I didn't belong. Then, just as I was finishing my coffee, Alicia sent a new message. This one was different. Alicia, please, we'll apologize. Just help us. I stared at the text for a long moment, tapping my fingers against the table. This was new. They had never apologized for anything. Ever. Not for the way they treated me. Not for the years of silent judgment. The constant condescension. The dismissive way they talked about my career, my ambitions, my worth. But now, Alicia was willing to say the word sorry because they needed something. I thought about it. I let the idea roll around in my head for a few minutes. Then I made a decision. I would help them, but on my terms. I typed out a response, each word carefully chosen. I want a public apology in the family group chat. A full-blown confession. Not just to me, but to everyone. Alicia saw the message immediately. The dots appeared as she started typing, then disappeared. She was hesitating. Of course she was. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about pride. But the silence only lasted a few minutes before she caved. Alicia. Fine. And then, just like that, the message popped up in the group chat. It was Helen who sent it. Helen, we have wronged your name. We treated him poorly, and now, when we need him the most, we realize how unfair we have been. If he chooses to forgive us, we will be grateful. If he doesn't, we understand why. It was humiliating for them, exactly what I wanted. Now I had the satisfaction of knowing that every single person who had once judged me, every aunt, uncle, and family friend who had looked at me like I wasn't good enough, now knew the truth. I let them think I would send the money. I let them sit in that humiliation for a full hour. Then I typed my final response. No. Just one word, simple, final. And then I blocked all of them. I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. It was over. Lawrence stayed in jail. And for the first time in my life, I was truly free. Blocking them was the most satisfying thing I had ever done. For years, I had been their punching bag, the man they dismissed and ignored until they needed something from me. Now, they were powerless. No money, no favors, no control over me. I sat in the diner for a while, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear beyond the horizon. The coffee in my cup had gone cold, but I didn't care. I was savoring this moment, the feeling of complete and total freedom. They had wanted me gone. Now, they had gotten exactly that. I thought about what was happening back at their house, the frantic phone calls, the panic, Alicia pacing up and down, probably furious at herself for sending that apology in the group chat. They had swallowed their pride, thinking it would get them what they wanted, and in the end, it had gotten them nothing. I took a deep breath and let out a slow exhale. This was peace. This was what it felt like to finally be done with people who never valued me. But even as I sat there, my phone buzzing every few minutes from unknown numbers, I knew they wouldn't give up that easily. People like Lawrence and Helen never did. They were too used to getting their way, too used to controlling everything around them. And now, for the first time, they had lost. I could only imagine the scene at their house. Helen sitting at the kitchen table, crying, Lawrence pacing like a caged lion, and Alicia desperately trying to come up with a new plan. I smirked as I imagined the frustration on Lawrence's face, his ego crumbling under the weight of his own failure. He had always acted like he was invincible, like he could never be touched. Now he was rotting in a jail cell. And I was sitting here, drinking coffee, watching the world move on without them. But then came the best message yet. A new unknown number popped up. Lawrence, when I get out, you better pray I don't find you. I burst out laughing. That was it. That was his big threat. Even now, even after everything, he still thought he had power over me. I typed back a simple response. Strong words for someone who needs my help. Try again. And then I blocked the number. I could only imagine his rage when he saw that message. It must have killed him, knowing that I had won, that I was free, while he was the one trapped, powerless, dependent on the same man he had spent years belittling. Poetic justice. I smiled to myself, left a tip on the table, and walked out of the diner. The night air was cool, crisp, refreshing. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't carrying the weight of someone else's expectations. I wasn't bending over backward, trying to prove myself to a family that never wanted me. I wasn't tolerating insults, pretending not to hear the whispers, or shrinking myself to fit into a place that had never been meant for me. I was free, and they would never forget it. The silence was refreshing. I hadn't realized how heavy the weight of my in-laws had been on my shoulders until I finally cut them off. It was like I had been carrying a burden for years, and now, for the first time, I could walk without dragging their expectations behind me. The world felt different, lighter, brighter, but I knew it wasn't over. People like Lawrence and Helen never learned their lessons the first time. They had spent their entire lives controlling others, bending people to their will. And now, they were the ones drowning. It must have driven Lawrence insane, sitting in a jail cell, powerless, while I, the man he had belittled for years, ignored him like he was nothing. Because that's what he was now. Nothing to me. I had given them a chance. I had made them beg, made them apologize publicly, humiliated them in front of their extended family. And yet, even after all of that, they still thought they could intimidate me. The moment Lawrence sent that pathetic threat, "When I get out, you better pray I don't find you," I knew he hadn't changed. So I blocked his number, and I knew that must have killed him inside. I pictured him sitting in that cold, cramped jail cell, gripping his cheap plastic phone with frustration burning through his veins. He wasn't used to being ignored. He wasn't used to being the one pleading for help. And yet here we were. I drove around for a while, letting the events of the past few days settle in my mind. I had left my old life behind, and I had no intention of returning. But I wasn't finished with them. Not yet. I checked my phone again. More missed calls. More texts from Alicia and Helen, all from new numbers since I had already blocked their original ones. Alicia, I can't believe you're doing this. Helen, we're really struggling. Please, just this once. Lawyer, your family needs you to help with Lawrence's case. He won't last long in there. I laughed at the last one. Lawrence's lawyer was texting me now. I could only imagine the desperation in that conversation. Try calling him again. He'll pick up. He blocked us. What? Try another number. They had spent years making sure I knew I wasn't part of their family. Now they had no choice but to crawl back to me. And that's when I decided I was going to give them a lesson they'd never forget. I typed out a single message in the family group chat, the same one where Helen had humiliated herself by admitting they had wronged me. "I'll help you, but only under one condition." Immediately, Alicia responded, "Alicia, anything, just say it." I grinned. "I want a public apology, a real one. I want Lawrence to go on record admitting everything he's done to me. I want it in writing. I want it in the newspaper. I want it posted online. I want the whole world to know the kind of man he really is." The typing bubbles appeared, then disappeared. Then silence. I could practically hear Lawrence's rage through the screen. He would never allow it. His reputation was everything to him. But now, his freedom depended on it. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then finally, "Alicia, you're enjoying this, aren't you?" "Me? You have no idea." I turned off my phone, leaned back in my seat and smiled, because no matter what happened next, I had already won. I sat in my car, watching as my phone screen remained empty. No new messages, no more calls. I had given them their final chance, an opportunity to make things right, to admit the truth, and they couldn't do it. Not that I was surprised. People like Lawrence and Helen were too proud, too used to getting their way. They had built their entire lives on control, manipulation, and appearances. The idea of making a public confession, of exposing their own hypocrisy, was simply unthinkable to them. And yet, they had expected me to fix their problems. That was the funniest part. Even after everything, even after throwing me away like I was nothing, they still believed I owed them something. But I didn't. Not anymore. And now, they were truly on their own. I let out a slow breath and finally turned my phone off for good. No more waiting. No more games. I had given them every opportunity to make things right, and they had failed. That was the end of it. It was time to move forward. I started my car and pulled out of the parking lot, feeling lighter than I had in years. For the first time, I wasn't chained to that house, to that family, to a woman who never truly loved me. I was free, and I wasn't going to waste that freedom. I had spent years trying to belong, fighting for a place in their world. But the truth was, I had been building my life in the wrong place. They had never been my family. But now, I had the chance to start fresh. No more proving myself, no more waiting for approval that was never coming. Just me, living life on my own terms. And as I drove away, leaving that chapter behind for good, I smiled, because I knew they would never forget me. And that was the best revenge of all. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.